and some people will trickle in when it's time. So hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to this event. My name is Tinu, I'm the Vice President Student Issues of CUSA, and this is the Policing Indigenous Movements event. So before we start, I would first like to do a land acknowledgement, especially with the circumstances of this event first. So, as we gather for this event, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place and privilege, and in doing so, recognize the various traditional lands on which we do our business and daily actions today. CUSA acknowledges that our work takes place on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. This event is part of our Minwadjiya Indigenous Celebration campaign, meaning to cherish or to cherish one's native land in the Algonquin language. We hope that this campaign and the events within it prove to be a step towards reconciliation and redress with our Indigenous students. So as we did that land acknowledgement, I hope everyone takes a time to reflect, even if you're not on Algonquin Anishinaabe land, it's still, again, important to reflect on the histories and experiences and the spaces that we take up today. So I assume y'all have heard me talk a bit more. I would like to introduce to you our wonderful guest for today. So these two novelists, professors, scholars, academics on the screen you see today are actually the authors of the book Policing Indigenous Movements, which is, again, the title of the event today. So right now we have Andrew Crosby and Jeffrey Monaghan. So Andrew Crosby is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Carleton. And Jeffrey Monaghan, which is, again, such an honor, is actually a professor at Carleton, specifically within the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. So these two are not only our fellow scholars, but they're literally Carleton's own academics. So really happy and really, again, grateful to have them here today. So without further ado, I'm actually going to pass the mic and everything to them. If you folks would like to introduce yourself even more and even describe, again, a brief synopsis of the novel, because again, some people were really, really excited to see that a topic like this was being, again, presented. I do like to apologize. My windows are open because my house is stuffy, so you may be hearing wind and cars and all of that, but I will be muted very soon. So as I said, I will be passing on the mic to them. But before I do that, please note that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the event, most likely, obviously, after the presentation. If you don't know where it is, it's actually at the very bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. And yes, that will basically be it. And you could submit it anonymously or not anonymously. Thank God I remembered to record because I actually forgot to stream on Facebook. So we're still live, but I wanted to stream on Facebook. So if you could just give me a quick moment on that. But I think actually you folks could start while I just figure out some things. So again, passing the torch. And thank you so much for being here.
All right, thank you so much for having us. Yeah, so what Jeff and I will do, I think we'll talk for about 20 minutes. We'll go back and forth a couple of times, you know, give a bit of an intro to the book and some of its arguments and case studies. And yeah, then we'll open up the floor and we're happy to answer any questions. So our book, Policing Indigenous Movements, is kind of the product of many years of work. It was published in 2018. It covers a period from roughly around 2006 or so up until 2016, roughly. We came to this topic. We are settlers, and we came to this from an approach of solidarity with Indigenous struggles for self-determination, and being involved with, you know, different types of groups, and learning about settler colonialism in on this land where we were both living at around that time, you know, 10 or so years ago. So yeah, I mean, over the years, over many decades, but as we were kind of growing and learning on this land, there's many Algonquin struggles from various Algonquin communities. We are in the territory of the Algonquin Nation. Thank you for that acknowledgement and introduction. So Algonquin communities over the years have struggled with settler encroachment, resource extraction, logging and clear cutting on their territories, mining, nuclear, damming their waterways, flooding their lands. So this is a long, it's long in the sense of a Canadian history, but the Canadian history on this land is quite short. So we have about 200 years of intense kind of settlement activity in this area, 400 years of contact with Europeans, where the Algonquins have lived on this land for millennia. So as settlers, we were interested in Indigenous struggles for self-determination, and a role that we believe we can play is exposing how the Canadian state and Canadian policing and security agencies criminalize, surveil, and police Indigenous peoples, communities, and movements, and frame them as threats to national security, as threats to the idea of Canada, the Canadian state itself, and to extractive capitalism, to resource development. So yeah, within this idea, we talk about the security state, which is a sprawling array of national security agencies, policing, intelligence actors, corporate and industry partners, public bureaucracies that are increasingly integrated through surveillance, partnerships, institutional partnerships, data banks, in efforts to disrupt or preempt what are interpreted as threats, national security threats. And this is increasingly happening in the context of the war on terror, where we see these national security resources, policing and security resources, directed toward domestic groups. And it can be different domestic groups, but we've seen these resources really directed at Indigenous groups that are challenging Canadian claims to their land. They're asserting self-determination. They're challenging resource extraction. So these groups are increasingly framed as threats, national security threats. And this is a long history in Canada. We're focusing on kind of the present time, and it's obviously ongoing. There's a lot of ongoing disputes. We have 4 case studies in the book. So we look at the Algonquins of Barrier Lake and their decades-long struggle against resource extraction and interference in their traditional governance structure and system. We look at the policing of the Northern Gateway pipelines, which that plan materialized over many years and had been resisted for many years. So we look at how Indigenous communities and environmental groups were framed as criminal extremists, environmental extremists. We look at the Idle No More movement, which was kind of erupted in late 2012, demanding Indigenous self-determination and a revisiting of the treaty relationship with Canada and the relationship as a whole. And then we look at the shale gas dispute around the Elsipogtog First Nation in southeastern New Brunswick in 2013. So those are kind of the 4 different case studies that we talk about. Our primary objective is to provide a detailed illustration of how these agencies of the security state are normalizing these pervasive practices surrounding policing Indigenous movements, and we do that through access to information research. So we requested hundreds and thousands of files through the Access to Information Act in Canada to kind of narrate how policing agencies and government agencies approach Indigenous challenges to Canadian sovereignty and to resource extraction. So I'm happy to chat a lot more if it comes up about access to information research. It can be a useful tool to do this type of research, but I'm going to pass it off to Jeff to talk more about those.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Thank you very much, Tinu, Kathleen, Watson, all the organizers for the event. We're very happy to be here. And so following up on Andy's comments, so we use case studies to kind of narrate, in some ways, a bit of a chronology. So the book really kind of starts at an early period of the War on Terror, maybe let's say the mid-late 2000s, and closes off closer to kind of 2015, 2016. And part of what we demonstrate and argue is that over this period of time, the kind of national security apparatus has just kind of become more and more bloated. It's grown and grown, and of course, with the kind of infrastructure of the War on Terror, which is, you know, material infrastructure in terms of like bureaucracies and agencies who are all getting more and more money in terms of the War on Terror, but it's also a discursive infrastructure. It's the way we talk about terrorism becomes radically transformed in the mid 2000s after 9/11. And of course, some of this predates 9/11. And so some of the work that we do, and part of our broader argument, is that the War on Terror is it is a racialized infrastructure. It is primarily targeting Muslims. And this kind of goes back a little bit even into the 90s, when all of a sudden police agencies and academics and think tanks came up with what was called the New Terrorism Thesis. Previous to the 1990s, in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, terrorism was thought as through a social movements lens. And it was mostly social movement scholars and sociologists that studied political violence and saw political violence as being animated by very specific political motives. But it was rational and it was focused on key objectives. And all of a sudden in the 90s, there's a whole bunch of different academics and Western kind of mouthpieces that put forward the New Terrorism Thesis that said terrorism is irrational, it's driven by Islam, it's about religion, it's people who hate our values. And that discursive infrastructure was picked up by the War on Terror. And it really kind of resonated in Canada and the United States and Western countries. And part of this narrative was really erasing Western violence. It was erasing geopolitics. And all it was is presenting Islamic terrorism as irrational, hedged against our values, and something we need to go and fight wars and increase surveillance and security powers at home and policing powers. So all of a sudden we have this kind of boom in terms of the security apparatus. And one of the arguments that we make more generally is that the targeting of Indigenous movements is a byproduct of this enormous security apparatus. So you have this security apparatus that grows and grows and grows over the last 2 decades. And what happens is so much of the rationale, the justification for new surveillance powers, new departments, new resources, new technologies, new policing units is that we need to get Al-Qaeda, eventually ISIS, but mostly Al-Qaeda when we start in terms of our narrative. But all of a sudden, you know, there's not that much Al-Qaeda domestically. And what happens is a byproduct of all of this is that these material infrastructures end up being used against domestic groups, and Indigenous groups end up being the real kind of first threshold in which national security resources break past their racialized infrastructure of targeting Muslims and engaging in Muslim surveillance and Muslim profiling into what can be called as kind of good old-fashioned colonial policing. And so all of a sudden, part of what we trace is you have these kind of bureaucratic organizations like critical infrastructure that starts being used in the mid-2000s. So we start having these different critical infrastructure protection programs, different agendas, new units that get built, gets kind of pillared into the national security apparatus. And all of a sudden, critical infrastructure kind of starts with this idea of, you know, you need to protect the nuclear plants because Al-Qaeda is going to blow it up, to all of a sudden shifting. And all of a sudden, the Algonquin of Barrier Lake, who are in, you know, north of Maniwaki, all of a sudden, the forestry road that they are blocking gets described as critical infrastructure. All of a sudden, different kind of pipeline infrastructure gets called it critical infrastructure. And as Andy alluded to, all of a sudden you have the security bureaucracy growing and inviting in private actors. So private security companies, private energy companies, all become networked and kind of deputized into the policing apparatus and start exerting a certain level of influence. And that's where things really kind of take off with the start of the pipeline disputes in, you know, around 2010 to 2015. The former Prime Minister Harper, committed to making Canada an energy superpower. And that's when we had all kinds of pipelines being proposed all over the place and all kinds of resistance. So we have all kinds of conflict points in which Indigenous movements, environmentalists, concerned residents, all kinds of folks were like, well, maybe pipelines aren't the best idea. We have not only land conflicts, we have climate change, we have all kinds of reasons not to be pursuing, expanding the tar sands. And all of a sudden, the security apparatus kind of ropes these groups in under critical infrastructure. So we kind of talk about this, and you also have the creation of this kind of like large scale dynamic of extremism. And extremism itself is a discourse of the war on terror, but it becomes more flexible and all of a sudden becomes applied in different ways. Multi-issue extremism, Aboriginal extremism, environmental extremism. And all of a sudden, this war on terror discursive infrastructure ends up being used for all kinds of good old-fashioned colonial policing, domestic policing. And so one of the points that we're really critical of is this notion that security should be ever expanded, that we should keep kind of expanding these notions of security. You see a lot of talk nowadays about neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and this idea of kind of using security infrastructure against those folks. We see that as an expansion of policing and security powers, and something that we're very critical of, and something that in terms of documenting what we've seen is that security ends up expanding, but it hones in and is embedded within a police culture, and a police culture that has much more of a tendency to target Indigenous groups, to target Muslims, to target racialized communities, and to target what we can call the kind of kind of suspect communities of the past, and not necessarily be used to address much more common and widespread issues of white supremacy. So I think I'll hand it off to Andy, who's got a specific case study to go through.
Thanks. Yeah. So I outlined some of the kind of the case studies of the book, but we open the book by talking about this RCMP project called Project Sitka, and this was a report that we came across while researching the book. So Project Sitka, was this police investigation in 2014. The report was published in 2015. The title was Serious Criminality Associated to Large Public Order Events with National Implications. Basically, this report was about surveilling and profiling activists, predominantly Indigenous activists, who were opposing extractive capitalism and asserting a politics of self-determination. So the context for this report, which they did this investigation in 2014, is coming right off the heels of the Idle No More movement and the Mi'kmaq resistance in southeastern New Brunswick that I mentioned around shale gas exploration. So what this Project Sitka did was create protester profiles on 313 identified activists. So, they determined that 313 people that they were aware of from various events, public order events, or Aboriginal public order events, as they call them, were identified. And then they ran these individuals through this protester profile to determine their level of volatility. So they categorized them as either volatile, disruptive, or passive. And out of the 313, they determined that 89 of these 313 individuals kind of fit their mold for their criteria for criminality is what they called it. So they were considered volatile. It matched their criteria for criminality, even though maybe no criminal offenses had ever happened. So through this kind of project, we can talk about an array of cases and events and issues surrounding Indigenous resistance to extractive capitalism and Canadian sovereignty and the policing of Indigenous resistance. So, coming out of Idle No More and the Mi'kmaq resistance in New Brunswick. More than half of the 89, for example, were Mi'kmaq that were involved in the resistance to the shale gas exploration dispute that transpired over many months in New Brunswick. And it culminated in this dramatic RCMP raid on a small blockade camp. There's a small blockade camp set up by the Mi'kmaq Warrior Society, had maybe a dozen or less people in it. They were blockading equipment used by the company SWN Resources, which is a Texas-based shale gas exploration fracking company, basically. And they had blockaded their equipment, so they couldn't go out and do their seismic testing and exploration for shale gas. So it culminated in this very dramatic kind of raid where the RCMP called in reinforcements from Prince Edward Island, from Nova Scotia, and from Quebec. Had over 400 personnel involved, 200 officers on the ground, carried out this kind of pre-dawn dramatic, heavily armed raid. It's pretty dramatic, but not quite uncommon when we're looking at kind of the history of settler colonial policing in Canada. We can see other instances where that's happened, and also recently Wet'suwet'en territory in the last couple of years, resisting those camps there, blocking access, blocking pipeline construction. So within this report, they talk about, they reference Idle No More, they reference missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, they reference natural resource development, they reference land claim settlements as kind of these issues that result in what they call Aboriginal public order events, where this potential for criminality occurs. So so these individuals, have profiles created, they're uploaded into police data banks kind of permanently, and they're available to this network of security state actors that Jeff described. I think that Sitka demonstrates that the level of surveillance and profiling that is used against Indigenous resistance, and over the last couple of years, even past the publication of this book, I think that it speaks to probably what's happening with ongoing resistance to pipelines construction in the West Coast and different disputes throughout what is known as Canada. So I think I'll pass it back, but I'm happy to chat about any case or issue later on.
Great, thanks, Andy. So we're going to wrap up with I guess 2 takeaways. One on the expansion of policing and security in contemporary society, and 2 on decolonization. So let me just say 1 point. I think I addressed this a little bit, but just to kind of retell, part of what we kind of put together is a bit of a narrative of what's happened over the last 2 decades of the War on Terror. And the War on Terror has dramatically expanded policing powers, dramatically expanded surveillance powers, as Andy described with Project Sitka. These kind of data banking technologies and techniques have greatly expanded, even since the 2 years that has passed since we published the book. There's just a dramatic expansion in the powers and the desire for both private companies, but also state agencies, and also kind of an interconnection between the two, to accumulate more and more data on us. And that gets used against political movements all the time. And so there's been this kind of dramatic expansion, and there's been, this withering of privacy protections, especially when national security or policing power is invoked. And so I think, one, we really underline a need to look at these forms, all kinds of social harms, and even forms of violence through a lens that's not security. when we invoke security, that ends up really kind of prioritizing and privileging policing institutions. But policing institutions themselves are problematic institutions. They recirculate a lot of gendered, racialized, and class-based disadvantages. And so when we kind of look at these different social conflicts, different harms, all kinds of different things, we really want to underline a need to address these problems in a way that's not policing or trying to police our way out of these problems. And so the second point I really want to underline, and we want to kind of end on a not so gloomy note, because we do really want to underline that over the last few years, we've made really, really good prominent steps towards advancing decolonial understanding and decolonial objectives. And I think one of the most challenging aspects of contemporary politics, and especially politics when it comes to Indigenous land in Canada, is that non-Indigenous people are incredibly ignorant and uneducated structurally, not just because we don't individually want to know more, but structurally the way we talk, educate, and build knowledge around the treaties and our treaty relationships as non-Indigenous people in Canada is remarkably poor. And I think it's really important to kind of underline that we are all party to the treaties. And these treaties are fundamentally premised on the notion of Indigenous sovereignty. And I think we've made a lot of progress in the last few years, certainly after Idle No More, after the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for understanding the notion of nation-to-nation relations. Even the talk of nation-to-nation relations 10 years ago was non-existent, and now that's become at least acceptable as a political discourse. But the reality of nation-to-nation relation and the spirit of the treaties is really sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty. And there have been cracks in our colonial infrastructure of governance in Canada, even cracks from places you wouldn't expect it. So in terms of political discourse, people like the Prime Minister talking about nation to nation, not that he totally understands what it means, but even in terms of the Supreme Court giving elements of recognition of Indigenous law and Indigenous title, those are still a step under sovereignty. But all of a sudden, because of Indigenous movements and Indigenous articulations of colonialism and decolonization, we are starting to really grapple with different relationships of refractured sovereignties, different ways of seeing and understanding our relationships that would respect Indigenous sovereignty over Indigenous land. And I think the real challenge of our generations and the real challenge of the next few decades is moving those ideas that are percolating and becoming more dominant and mainstream in contemporary society, moving those into real concrete political relationships that embrace decolonization. Canada has been here for a long time and we have not decolonized. We are not post-colonial. We still have very strong colonial structures of governance. And the challenge for us going forward is taking some of the building blocks that have arisen over the last few years and trying to really build them in to what would be forms of coexisting but mutually recognizing forms of sovereignty. So that that is something that we tie in with policing. We can't have Indigenous sovereignty and decolonialism without reining back the policing apparatus more broadly, and the national security policing apparatus is really on the front tip because the national security policing apparatus is really one of the kind of tips of the spear in terms of Indigenous people asserting sovereignty, immediately get classified in the way that Andy described as threats, economic threats, political threats, and become these kind of sites of surveillance and suppression within the policing apparatus. So thanks a lot for inviting us to talk, and we're happy to chat in the Q&A.
Thank you so much to the both of you for, again, giving us a quite succinct but great rundown on, again, the nuances of the topic. I had some few questions on my own that I actually got through the presentation, but I know some questions are coming in. So right now, folks, will be the segments where if you had any specific questions at all, you could go ahead and ask. If you are comfortable, obviously you could type it. There's a Q&A function at the bottom, or if you would like to just answer or like say through video or audio of some sort, all you need to do is raise your hand. I'll be notified of that and I could let you again ask the question. So we actually have quite a few, so let's get started within it. So one person asked, can modern treaties be used to strengthen Indigenous land management? If so, how can settlers contribute to strengthening Indigenous land control / decision-making in the communities we live in? Hold on, I want to see if Andy and Jeff, can you see the questions? Okay, that's good. So I'm not just reading to read. Okay, so I'm just going to read it for the audience, obviously, and then if any of you folks would like to answer that in your own take, we can go off with it.
I can start. Yeah, so the question's about modern treaties. Yeah, I think Jeff raised a really important point about the treaty relationship and how that is approached in settler society. And yeah, modern treaties are kind of an approach over the last few decades to address quote unquote Aboriginal land claims, so Indigenous claims to their land. Yeah, I think around like the larger issue of the treaty relationship really became unraveled during Idle No More, and discussions around, you know, a nation to nation relationship, the treaty relationship. There was you know, here in Ottawa in during January 2013, there were big meetings that were held. There were massive protests that were held. If you remember, Teresa Spence was on hunger strike on Victoria Island on the Ottawa River, and this really put the national and international spotlight on the idea of treaties, the treaty relationship, and nation to nation relationship. So yeah. There's a larger discussion about the history of treaties. First, you know, treaties prior to the Canadian states was 1867, then treaties that the Canadian state made, and now there's the modern treaty framework, which was kind of initiated in the 1960s and has evolved in various manifestations to the present day. So there are different types of modern treaties to try to settle land claims. There's a lot of critiques against the modern treaty framework. I don't know if it's our position to really say which Indigenous communities or nations should be, you know, how they should be engaging or not. I think that what we can do and what we have done is look at, through access to information research, we can access internal documents that show how treaty making is approached from the inside through the colonial bureaucracy, and we've done that. We've seen that in presentations created during Idle No More, for example, from Indigenous Affairs, the Department of Indigenous Affairs, the federal department here in Ottawa, Gatineau, how they approach the treaty relationship, and they're very stark, and they admit that the positions, the Indigenous position and the settler position, is completely contrasted to each other, where the settlers society's Canadian state approach is that treaties meant that Indigenous people gave up their land. We don't owe them anything for that. That's what that is. And then, but they recognize that Indigenous peoples have a fundamentally different idea of the ideas of treaties, and what Jeff said, not abandoning or giving up jurisdiction or sovereignty to their lands. So it's a really large and important discussion, and should be ongoing.
Can I just add a quick one too onto Andy? You know, a lot of the critiques coming from Indigenous communities around the modern treaties they're highly critical. Some communities, of course, are on board, but the key thing for me in terms of approaching these agreements that they're not necessarily decolonial agreements, right? A lot of these agreements are really about making what we can call mini municipalities or kind of indigenous municipalities. So a lot of them actually terminate. And Russell Daibo does some great work on this. I don't know if I can put that in a chat, but he calls them termination agreements because it actually terminates prior agreements around title. So it in fact, you know, from Canada and a kind of settler position, the government's position for the new modern treaties is that these are actually post-colonial approaches, not decolonial. So they're actually just kind of saying colonial's shitty and it's too bad, but let's get to a post-colonial kind of fully assimilated position where Indigenous people would kind of have a municipal government, but that's not a decolonized sovereign form of relationship.
Okay, I like that. You see, I feel like Professor Monaghan, you should have been one of my professors because I like this. I like the honesty, the blatancy of everything. So I guess if that's all the additions to that question, I'll say that that's been answered. In essence of time, because I know Andy needs to go right at 6, we may blow through these questions a little bit, but I'm gonna actually jump to a question that has to do with like technical clarification. So Watson asked for a technical clarification for the audience. Can you explain the distinction between colonialism and settler colonialism as described by Glenn Coulthard from your book? Again, plug in your book because we love to do that.
Thanks for that. I'll talk for a minute and hand it to Jeff. The ideas of colonialism and settler colonialism. Colonialism is the idea of kind of colonial powers, European powers, accessing, trying to control lands from the colonial centers. So it's not about coming to stay or to settle the land to bring settlers. It's about extracting resources, extracting labor from Indigenous populations. Whereas settler colonialism, which we see in settler colonial societies in states like Canada, the United States, Australia, where as kind of settlers, contact is based around kind of first extraction and ongoing extraction, but also settlement. So where settlers become the dominant and majoritarian population in these locations. So yeah, not necessarily depending on Indigenous populations for labor, but more kind of taking the main premise is to access, control the land. So yeah, I'll hand it to Jeff for follow that.
I just add quickly that a key component that we build on and Glenn builds on as well is that genocide is a part of that program. So the program of settler colonialism doesn't necessarily require indigeneity or Indigenous people within the body politic. It is about replacing, assimilating in, and genocide is at the core of that project. So in different ways, Canada has, obviously a very different kind of political narrative about the genesis of our country vis-a-vis the United States, in a lot of ways that we think about Canadian identity and we think about Canadian history is that the United States was so shitty and violent and kind of like a Wild West frontier. And we tell this story about ourselves that's much more humane and much more civilized and much more progressive. And what's really important and why we draw from some of Glenn's work is that he's quite critical of that humane spirit, because he really underlines that humaneness was really still about assimilation and the prioritization of Western values, this kind of Eurocentric idea of white supremacy, where the values, the civilization of Europe, and especially kind of England, maybe a little bit of French in there as well, But certainly this kind of Protestant notions of individualism, of certain types of work, very much strong notions about the family, and certainly around race, all end up being valorized as the norm and the kind of dominant values of Canada. And of course, in the kind of the humane approach was then to assimilate others into that norm. And so what we really draw from Glenn is that, you know, genocide needs to be thought of differently. And there's a whole bunch of other scholars who are really into this that don't want to just position genocide as the Holocaust and the Second World War and Hitler, but want to really, like, of course, that's an element of genocide and a particular iteration of genocide, but they want to think of genocide as a much broader process, maybe kind of like a slow, consistent genocide that does revolve around this idea of elimination of indigeneity and indigenous culture.
Okay, I love that. So as you could see between the, again, explanation of both, oh, yes. Oh, more questions are coming in. Okay, so I'll actually speed my portion up. If you have any more questions, please actually put them in. I'll be more than happy to pass them on to Jeff and Andy. And like, obviously they're busy doing prof things and PhD things. So obviously in their due time, they would be happy to, again, respond to you in any of that sense if we don't get to your question. But please keep them coming in, especially when it comes to these topics. And yes, I'll keep that short. So the question actually that I'm about to put is a pretty long one. And it was submitted by Wolfgang. Hi, Wolfgang. Thank you so much for coming. And it says, looking at Bill C-51, the Anti-Racism Act, where Canada argues that disrupting Canada's economy, such as resource extraction, is a terrorist act which targets Indigenous peoples. How does this conflict with the proposing of UNDRIP into Canadian legislation in terms of not forcefully, removing Indigenous peoples from their lands and recognizing Indigenous sovereignty through self-determination, self-governance, and control over their lands? It's a really good question. For those of you who did not get that, I will be submitting it in the chat. And if you folks want to take a minute, if needed be, to answer, we can.
Monaghan? Anti-Terrorism Act?
I can go first, or you can.
Sure, I'm gonna just bring the question up. Yeah, well, I think maybe I'll talk a bit about UNDRIP and let Jeff talk about Bill C-51. Yeah, so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you know, this is kind of a United Nations international framework, very important framework that, you know, that lays out a lot of principles around kind of Indigenous rights to their land and existence in kind of in various kind of jurisdictions throughout the world. But yeah, I think that we see, I'll let Jeff talk more about the act, the Anti-Terror Act itself, but you know, it does kind of bring in this idea of threats to critical infrastructure, which is a prominent theme in the book, and threats to the Canadian economy and national resources as representing a national security threat. Yeah, like I think that the UNDRIP is would be something that should be seriously considered and kind of passed as law in Canada. I think the province of British Columbia is doing an iteration of it, but that's also drawn critique from not going far enough. And I think it goes back to the idea of that Jeff was mentioning, is like with the modern treaty framework, Canadian political attempts to incorporate these types of frameworks, they attempt to do it in a way that doesn't undermine Canadian sovereignty. So I'm not sure if that answers it, but I'm going to pass it off.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, and it's a great question, Wolfgang. I think you've like really pointed out a very blatant kind of point of contradiction. So, and just off of Andy's point, I think, if you can remember back to the 2015 election when Trudeau was campaigning, he campaigned on UNDRIP. And I think, there was probably an aspect of him maybe that was attracted to this. It was part of his political brand at the time. And I think he got into power. And then all of a sudden, the entourage that kind of work and know how Parliament runs told them that this is not going to happen. And certainly, I think they've been trying to twist themselves into pretzels, figuring out how to make it work and not undermine Canadian sovereignty, but that would be quite the pretzel move. In terms of just adding to C-51 and then what became the new Anti-Terrorism Act, which is C-59, which is way worse than C-51. Just a quick point that, they do, there's kind of very careful language in both of those acts, C-59 being the newer one, that says, national security agencies and counterterrorism will not criminalize dissent. And so there's like this very careful wording in the laws. But one thing that we really like to underline, that there's a big difference between kind of laws on paper and policing in practice. And I think what we document is policing in practice. And one of the reasons we use the Access to Information Act is that we narrate how policing works by using their very own records. And I think that's really important because it shows the discrepancy between, law on paper and then how laws are implemented by policing in practice. And those are much different worlds. And police culture are very strong institutions. It's very, very hard for political authorities or legal authorities to direct and control policing agencies. Policing culture is very opaque and strong. And there are very deeply ingrained patterns and practices and attitudes that drive police and policing culture, which have targeted Indigenous movements for a long time, especially when Indigenous movements challenge Canadian sovereignty, and especially when they challenge economics, and pipelines being the kind of current iteration of that. It was, mining 10, 20 years ago, it was forestry before that, but pipelines are our current conflict flashpoints. So thank you for the question. It was a really good question.
Yes, I was even just rereading it as well. And Andy and Jeff, if we have time, we could go back on it because I know it's a pretty heavy question. I was even thinking, and if you were to write an essay or paper on that, I think that'd be really interesting. Moving on, again, thank you so much, everyone, again, for taking the time to come out here and even submitting your questions as well. These are really thought-provoking. So I think we're gonna switch it up just a bit because I know some people are here from Carleton's finest climate clubs, sustainability clubs, environmental justice clubs, and so forth. So a question that we have is, how can advocates of clean energy alternatives be sure that new infrastructure doesn't displace and harm Indigenous communities like fossil energy does? What are some red flags for projects, and what can citizens do? Again, I'll be putting these questions in the chat because I know attendees can't see them so that they could have them. But if Andy or Jeff, if you would like to go on and take a stab at this.
Yeah, I'll take an initial take on it. Yeah, I think that any energy project, any kind of initiative or of any type of energy infrastructure, there's a serious problem in Canada around consultation and obtaining free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous nations for encroaching on their territories and on their lands. And we've seen that time and again, and continuously and increasingly resulting in conflict. So I think that Canada lacks a framework of appropriate consultation that meets Indigenous law and even Canadian law. So I think that's kind of my what I'm thinking of first when you're talking about developing energy infrastructure on Indigenous lands. And then there's a whole political entanglement around how the Canadian state manipulates and strategizes around getting buy-in for projects and doing consultation. Yeah, we saw that unravel, during around pipeline proposals on the West Coast and the National Energy Board's demise. So yeah, it's politically tricky, and it's something that we can do is kind of access internal records to show how messed up it is and how they think about ways to access Indigenous lands, more creative ways. Yeah.
I don't have much to add. It's a great question. I don't really know the answer. I think it's really tough, and specifically because some of the points that Andy's making just about, we lack a real, Canada's had such a history of just taking that we lack a real kind of framework for Indigenous communities making these decisions themselves. So it's tough is the question, or is the answer. It's a tough question too.
I actually just wanted to take a minute to also acknowledge those who are watching on Facebook Live as well. I've been in and out on the Zoom and watching out. So thank you so much for that. There's even been a comment that I forgot what it was for, but a person said probably one of the most interesting courses I took in my undergrad at Carleton with Professor Monaghan. So I guess we have some alumni here who is streaming with us on Facebook. So thank you for that. And I guess we're moving on, a little bit crunch for time. So I think we could take 1 to 2 more questions. Okay, I'm gonna go with the trustee one, or Jeff and Andy, do you have a question? I know you could see them that you want to answer specifically, or I could just pick, because I know we have about 5 questions written, 4 to 5 written on here. No? Okay.
Yeah, Andy, did you have any? The trustee one's great.
Yeah.
The last question in there about the veto, I'd like to just pick up on, and maybe Andy, you can pick one after. But the last question in that says, conservatives often point to UNDRIP as giving indigenous people a veto over projects. Is that accurate? If so, is an effective veto an anti-colonial tool?
Yes,
so I really love that question, because I think, your last point is absolutely correct. The problem is, the conservatives use this, that's dog whistle politics right there, right? When the conservatives say veto and indigenous veto, they are kind of, kind of playing into an entire conservative base that has this repertoire of standoffs and hotspot conflicts in Canada that has recirculated this idea that Indigenous people are hedged against the Canadian state, or are hedged against our economy, and all of these different kind of very racialized depictions of Indigenous people. So that's a really twisted question in some ways, or it's a twisted situation, because the popularity of that language is a very racist, deeply embedded racial language that depicts Indigenous people as kind of anti-Canadian in some kind of way. And it's an alternate reality, because the reality, of course, is that we've been mostly exploiting our relationships and ignoring and kind of erasing treaty relationships to kind of take and make lots of money. So there's that element, but I think your final point is that UNDRIP it all depends on how that is actually implemented in the Canadian context. Who knows, right? But like the principles of UNDRIP are decolonial principles. And you're absolutely right. It would give sovereignty and decision-making capacities, if implemented properly, to Indigenous communities who would have control over the resources that they're entitled to control. So presenting it as a veto kind of is twisted and racist, but it's also misrepresentation, because it's basically just like they're entitled to the authority that they're entitled to. But when you call it a veto, it's assuming that you're entitled to that authority, and they're vetoing what your entitlement is, but you don't in fact have an entitlement over it. So So it's a really twisted language. It's a very dangerous discourse, but you're absolutely right. I think that's why we support UNDRIP, is precisely because it's a decolonial principles. It's based on decolonial principles, and it would return forms of authority to Indigenous communities.
Yep. Great points. Great questions. I will. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah. So I see the one from Watson about infrastructure disruption and labeling as violent. Maybe that's a good one to end on, because it seems quite negative of, you know, framing and labeling Indigenous peoples and movements and communities as violent. But I think we can draw some positivity out of that. So, you know, the Aboriginal extremism label has been around, you know, as far as we know, since the early to mid 2000s. That's when we first see it. It could have been around before, where we see these labels of violent Aboriginal extremism and violent environmental extremism, some iteration of that, criminal environmentalism, extremism, something like that, is around the time of Project Sitka. It's not necessarily in the Project Sitka report, although it could be, but the RCMP is producing other reports around that time. And they produced one in 2014 around threats to the Canadian petroleum industry. And this is where we see this label. And the year is significant. So as we talked about, you know, 2012, 2013 was the years of Idle No More uprising, the shale gas resistance in north and southeastern New Brunswick around Elsipogtog First Nation. And it was really the Mi'kmaq that got labeled as violent Aboriginal extremists. So what we saw from that kind of dramatic police raid that I described at the time, you know, this is a culmination of months and even years of resistance to shale gas exploration in that part of the province of New Brunswick, where, you know, Francophone, Anglophone, and Indigenous Mi'kmaq communities work together to stop shale gas exploration. They're like, no, we don't want this exploration here. We don't want the water to be threatened, our water supply. So it all came to a head with this dramatic raid, and we document, you know, very closely this raid in that chapter in the book, because we have the RCMP's briefing notes that create the timelines, and we kind of demonstrate that what they display in their press conferences, that there are violent Indigenous people at this blockade and protests, and we had to respond to it. Well, you know, we show that that where the violence was initiated from. That was from the RCMP carrying out this heavily armed raid on the camp, and once the camp was attacked, the community, the Elsipogtog First Nation community members came, and there was a standoff with police, and police attacked them as well. They made over 40 arrests. In the process, a number of RCMP vehicles were torched. So, you know, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dollars of loss. Another tactic from that summer of standoffs was equipment was also destroyed. So seismic testing equipment. So, you know, we see that the label of violence being put against Indigenous folks in relation to the destruction of property. So that's where the violent Aboriginal extremism label comes out of, and any kind of threats to critical infrastructure are labeled as violent, even critical infrastructure that doesn't exist yet. So like the pipelines on the West Coast that aren't built yet, those folks, the Wet'suwet'en and others, Tiny House Warriors, you know, they also get painted with this label of being violent, which is indeed problematic. So the positive note is that the resistance in Mi'kmaq in southeastern New Brunswick was successful. The company, it wasn't over after the raid. There was 2 or 3 more months of conflict, but the company packed up and left the province, has not come back. It created a political change where there was a moratorium on shale gas exploration in the province. So it led to a positive outcome in that sense. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, Thank you again so much for answering these questions. Thank you to those who submitted these questions. It is 6, so I know, Andy, you need to go very, very soon. So I'm just going to close everything off. So there ends actually the event. It was very, very interesting. Can't believe that an hour has passed since we started. So some very interesting topics. Firstly, I would like to thank both Andy and Jeff. It's kind of awkward kind of calling you folks by your first names. But thank you so much for, again, choosing to take the time out of your days to come out and, again, bless us with the knowledge on these things. Before I know Andy needs to go, I would like for you folks to plug in your book as well and where we could actually purchase it if necessary, because this is only a snapshot on what's actually, again, in the book and some of the questions and knowledge that you may get out of it. So if anyone wants to plug it in, that'd be great. Yeah, no, sure. I know I saw it on Amazon, but I don't know if you could actually purchase it from Amazon, but anyone could like jump in at any time. Oh, and you just put it in.
I just posted a link. You can order it directly from Fernwood, and probably maybe your local bookstores like Octopus Books.
That's great. Thank you again. Thank you so much for that. Folks, please make sure to check it out, especially because these are written by our own Carleton researchers here. And again, I would like to thank everyone for attending the event. Special thanks to Andy and Jeff again for, again, coming with your presentation and answering these questions. Special thanks to Watson and Kiara as well for bringing these issues to light, especially for proposing that we get you to. Special thanks to Kathleen. She was background with me trying to run around as well. So special thanks to you, Kathleen, and obviously Carly, our comms director, for, again, running around in the background with us and doing their wonderful work. So there ends the event. Hope everyone has a great day. However, though, if Andy and Jeff, if you have some closing remarks, more than happy for you folks to take us off.
Yeah, I would just like to thank you and your team there for organizing this and taking the time and your interest in this. And yeah, we're happy to chat again sometime in the future. Happy to answer any questions. You can find our information, I think, through at Carleton. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry that I have to go. There's another Zoom that I'm going to hop into, but I really appreciate it.
Yes,
and thank you very much for the great questions, everyone. For those, I just answered some of the questions on the side, but if it didn't work and you didn't have your question answered, feel free to email. But thank you for the great questions and thanks to the organizers. Nice seeing you, Andy.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Kathleen, if you want to